free to list them in the chat bar. And also, if you have a question and you want to use by voice, one of the best ways to do that is use the hand raise function. But also just feel free to chime in as we have our conversation. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Chris Jaramillo. He will be the first speaker in this ongoing discussion about how New Mexico is globally relevant, particularly in the commercial and managerial aspects of how we connect to the world. And Chris has a close relationship with Global Ties. He was on their board of directors, and he has been an attorney in Albuquerque who has been doing legal and economic diplomacy for a very long time. He is also going to talk to us about the Middle East, North Africa region. And I thought it would be really important for us to get a context about the MENA region right now, particularly because of some of the newsworthy issues that are going on in the world, particularly Israel and the United Arab Emirates generating peace accords in a way that will facilitate both political and commercial activity. Chris has experience with these particular issues, and he's going to share with us how economic diplomacy has happened through his experiences here in New Mexico and how it relates to the Middle East, North Africa region. So please, everybody, give a warm welcome to Chris. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So the floor is all yours, Chris.
Right. You know, I'll start real quick and be brief about why I'm in front of you. I always ask myself that about presenters. Why the heck is this person sitting in front of me and telling me things? So I was born in the village of Tijeras here in New Mexico, pretty much Albuquerque. Went to school, CNM, UNM Law School, worked for the legislature and finance committee. At the same time, or prior to that, I had done some work with the Hunt Institute of Global Competitiveness in researching infrastructure, really bureaucracy that would prevent infrastructure, but we positioned it as infrastructure development. And that was focused on railroads. I'm sure you're going to hear more about that from Randy later on. Great resource, fantastic wealth of knowledge and practical experience on the ground. Crossed paths with him over the time. We were working on what would it look like to create a relationship between Mexico and the US with the light rail system, or rail system in general. Fascinating. We can talk about that another time, or there'll be some relevance here. That really opened up my eyes to economic development in an international scale. I also, during law school, did the Indian law program, which I also consider international studies, being these are sovereign nations that we are lucky to have in and around New Mexico. So that's my basis. My family is also heirs to land grants and acequias, which complicates a lot of cultural and economic development issues for budding neighbors like Albuquerque, who's impending on certain areas that have cultural and historic relevance related to the land grants and the acequias. For those of you that aren't familiar with those, it was basically carve-outs for heirs of the Spanish crown, as they said, as a result of the Mexican-American War. And it was codified in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And then from there went through a confirmation process, which has some fascinating issues to deal with. Basically, the land wasn't granted at the same level that it was in the treaty. Happy to talk more about that some other time, or over some coffee or a drink one day, if any of you are interested. And so that gives you some idea of like, why is this person in front of me talking about these issues? At the same time, that is important to know because water is a fundamental issue that I've always been interested in and dealt with, whether through my family's ranch or whether through land grants or dealing with the acequias or in law school. And that's really what spurred my interest in the Middle East. That's the connector right there, is water. So real quick, I'll go through a rundown of context of why are we talking about the MENA region, and in particular, why are we going to talk about Israel and what it's been going through over time. So Israel, for those of you who aren't very familiar with it, it was a region, or is a region, that had its birth, so to speak, in 1948. It declared its independence. 1949, it's admitted as a member of the UN. And very, very, very shortly thereafter, you start to see a lot of conflict in that region. I mean, there's always been conflict in that region, but I'm talking contemporary time. During this time, you had the Palestinian relationship and the Israeli relationship really come to a head. This is still going on to this day. It is a very big issue. There's a lot of heat around this issue. There's a lot of different perspectives around this issue. And with that, I welcome you to challenge me on anything that I have to say, because this isn't a presentation on total, this is how it is. This is my experience in that region. And so, I've been to Israel now twice. I went in 2016. The last time I went was in 2019, last summer. At that point, I was lucky enough to be able to go into the West Bank as well. And that is a very important aspect for visiting this region, because if you do not get the other side of the conversation, you're really not getting the full picture of what's going on there. We attempted to go in 2016. However, there were some security issues that prevented that, so it had to be scrapped at the last minute. So why is it important? Israel, as it is now, this is the current region, right? If you can zoom in and see that, it will show that it is a very, very, very small country. It is the size of New Jersey, landmass-wise. It's tiny. And it's surrounded by a lot of countries that are contentious to it in terms of its ideology or its existence in general, how it came about. There's a lot that can be said about that. I mean, there are full classes and scholars that spend their whole lives dealing with this. So I'm giving a very broad brushstrokes overview. And if there's any questions, please feel free to let me know. I'm not the most well-versed in Zoom. So if you just chime in, that's helpful as well. So getting back to the region, what we see in modern day Israel now is a result of 1967. What happened in 1967? You had what they call the 6-Day War. It was literally from June 5th to June 10th, 6 days. At this time, you had Israel capture, and I say capture because that's exactly what they did. It was not, it wasn't a friendly thing. It was a war. And they captured the Golan Heights, which are in Tan. They captured that from Syria. They captured the West Bank from Jordan, and they captured Gaza Strip from what is now, modern day Egypt. It is a very contentious area right now, and continues to be so day in and day out. There's rockets fired the other day from Gaza into Israel at the signing of the United Arab Emirates agreement with Israel and Bahrain. And likewise, Israel fired right back. So it's not one-sided. This tends to be a very contentious conflict that it has a lot of emotion into it and a lot of history. So why I'm setting the stage for what's important here to understand about the region is that this region continues to have ongoing conflict rooted from deep historical context. Fast forward, and you have 1993, what's called the Oslo Accords. These are two agreements that are signed by the Palestinian Liberation Authority, Palestinian Liberation, let me get this right, organization, not authority, organization, and Israel. Why is this important? Well, as a result of this, what it did was say, we're going to work together in terms of trade. However, Israel is going to maintain maritime and airspace control. So what does that mean? They control the airports, they control the seaports. This is massive, massive implications on economic development. Why? Because Palestine does not have free authority to direct how it does any sort of trade in the region. It has to go through a third party, which at this point is Israel. So going back to 1967, the Palestinian will see this, and rightfully so, as an occupation. From 1967, this will continue to 2005. In between, there are these negotiations going on, like the Oslo Accords. That happens in 1993, and that starts to ease some of the trade tensions going on. It is an attempt to bring everyone together to start to get towards a peace deal. In 2005, a big point happens, and Israel conducts what they call their unilateral disengagement. They start to pull out of Gaza. The reason this is important is because at this point, they're still maintaining control of the seaports, they're still maintaining control of the airspace, and now they're controlling the land channels into Israel. So again, they control how trade is done in Gaza at this point. At this time, you have a fraction in the Palestinian region. You have the Fatah, which is a political entity, and you have Hamas. I don't quite qualify Hamas as a political entity. They are a Sunni Islamic fundamentalist terrorist organization. That is my view on it. Not everyone sees it that way. But this group and the Fatah end up having a civil war. At this point, some of this war spills off into Israel, and there's a lot of bombs, suicide bombs, rockets, so on and so forth that go on. Over time, 2006, Hamas is now elected to be the governing body in Gaza. Why is this important? Because the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Authority, pulls out of Gaza and moves into the West Bank region. They no longer start to have control of Gaza. Now they do have control of the West Bank. Why is this also important? Israel, the United States, Canada, the European Union all start to freeze trade relations with Palestine because Hamas has taken over. This is a big deal. This is now seen as what we call the cutoff, right? A lot of people say, and rightfully so, that Gaza is now cut off from the world. They cannot have trade. They cannot have economic development go on in a very densely populated area. So you have that happen, and you have Israel now controlling the airspace and the seaports and the land crossings, as well as now Egypt also controls the land crossings to the south. That is a big deal. This is what we see now in Israel at this point. We see that in this region right here, to the south, Gaza, I mean, it's very difficult because it's such a tiny region, but in the south, Gaza is controlled by land crossings, is controlled by Egypt. And in the north, it's controlled by, north, and it'll probably be the east as well. It'll be controlled by Israel. And then they also control the seaport access. Now, why is that important? Well, because if you can't control how you conduct trade, how are you going to conduct economic development? This is a very fair critique of what is going on in the region. It's complicated. Why is it complicated? Because in this region, there's no one answer, and there's real loss of life going on. This isn't just an academic debate. This is something that we are sitting here talking about it in terms of maps, but every day there's real loss of life going And what is going on in Gaza is really intense, and there's a lot of despair. There's a lack of access to basic needs, water, food, resources, healthcare. At this point, what you have to also understand is that now Gaza is entirely reliant on Israel for energy, electricity, food, aid. They cannot produce what they used to produce, which was once a really robust region that had a lot of trade possibilities, is no longer. So why is that important? Because now what's happened is you have Israel starting to beef up its economic development in its own country, and you have this juxtaposed experience miles apart from each other. You have a really bustling Tel Aviv metropolitan area. I mean, for those of you who have looked it up or maybe have been, you can relate that it's like in New York, it's like in LA on the beach. It's a fantastic place to be. But you cannot help but think, just south, not even an hour, maybe 2 hours at most, you have a country that is experiencing, developing or third world, whatever the politically correct term is at this point in time, conditions. That's a real thing. That is a fact. Whether it's a fact that people want to deal with or not, it's real. So without focusing too much on that conflict, I give you that because this is where border issues come to a head. Relationships matter, as we all know. We conduct relationships in the United States with our neighbors in a relatively friendly manner. Put aside what we've been seeing going on in the political sphere lately in terms of rhetoric about our neighbors to the south, generally speaking, in terms of actual conflict, we're not at war with anyone. That's what I mean in a friendly manner. I don't mean, words necessarily. I mean actual real conflict where there's people firing rockets or missiles or lighting crops on fire, things like that. That is not occurring in our region. And I really hope it doesn't ever occur. And that's when I say friendly, that's what I mean, in a relatively friendly manner. So the Palestinian conflict has a big impact on Israel and in terms of their trade relations. It affects their relationship with Jordan. It affects their relationship with Syria. It affects their relationship for a long time with Saudi Arabia. It still does to some degree. Egypt, they have since eased their relationship with Egypt quite a bit. And there's a lot of trade and relations going on there. Now, to Dr. Montoya's point earlier, what we saw happen this week was a peace agreement. And I put that in quotes because there's a real critique there that, well, these countries weren't ever at war with each other. They weren't at real conflict with each other. Fair. To me, I see it as an economic transaction. It was an agreement that says, hey, ideologically, we may have these differences because of our religious values or cultural values. That doesn't mean we're at conflict with each other. That means we just have differences with each other, in my opinion. And hold on, I'm getting to the chat. So, sorry about that. I'm learning this Zoom stuff. Yes, I do think it was a normalization of trade relations. Absolutely. I don't see it as a peace agreement. I see that as a little bit of some political posturing and ideological differences in terms of how we view things. But the result is that it may have a domino effect in the region. That is a real possibility. And if Saudi Arabia comes to the table now to create some trade relations, it is really start to put pressure on the other countries around Israel to say, how do we enter into at least trade relations with individuals so that we can understand how we can at least conduct business with one another, even if we have differences. I do think there's a distinction between differences and conflict, that unfortunately it's a nuance and it's easier to posture it that way for political purposes rather than economic purposes. Put all that aside for the moment. The other thing about the region that we have to understand is cultural relevance. There are big differences in terms of the Jewish community and the Arab communities in this region. That's a fact. That is not something that anyone can really dispute. Now, the basis for it, the reason for it, whether it's just what's happening, those are all very, very debatable nuances. But the fact is there is a difference. And how do you come to the table and discuss these differences with one another in a way that is not demeaning and is actually going to cultivate some sort of healthy relationship is more of an art than it is a science. The last time I was there, I had a really, truly, it was an honor and a pleasure to sit with Dr. Sharab Erekrat. Gosh, I probably butchered that. He is the chief negotiator for the Palestinian Authority, or Palestinian Liberation Organization. This gentleman is who negotiated the Oslo Accords. He is also the one that is the main negotiator right now between Israel and the US, although the US doesn't really have a lot of negotiations going on with Palestine at this point in time, unfortunately. The concept of time, from his perspective, which was fascinating to me, was the concept of time in Arab countries is very different than in Western countries. Why? Because of the history that Arab countries have in this region. In other words, if you're going to do any digging in Israel, like to build a house, you have to go through an archaeological process because there's so much history in this region. Anything under 500 years doesn't matter to them. That's not considered antiquity, which is just mind-blowing. Some of the oldest cities in our current country are way younger than 500 years, and we consider those to be very culturally relevant to us. I do think they're culturally relevant. We're lucky in New Mexico because we have some exceptions to that, considering our indigenous populations that do have a lot deeper history in this region. So when I say the concept of time, you have to understand that some of these countries have what they consider a 3,000-year plan. I don't know if the US has a 500-year plan, much less a 3,000-year plan. So the concept of time is very different. Why is that at all important? Because when we sit down with someone to start talking about trade relations, there's a sense of immediacy. There's a sense of time is money, right? We hear that all the time in business. Let's get it done. Let's get this deal closed. Let's do this, that, or the other. There is no investment from my experience, there's a lack of investment in your genuine concern for the other person's well-being, your genuine concern for that person's cultural preservation, your genuine concern for that person's community development. If you lack that cultural sensitivity, you won't ever get past that first discussion with them. Therefore, negotiations will never go beyond that. That's my personal experience. There are certain regions and certain cultures that you have to be aware of these sort of things. And so I'm going to pause there because I think Dr. Montoya has a question he wants to ask, and I want to get to it.
Yeah, I would like you to share with the group a little bit about what specifically you've done in the MENA region. Like, what kind of what was your purpose or mission when you were visiting there, and what can you share with them about what that says about New Mexico?
Right. Yeah. So my point in being there was to understand water development, technology. There's a great book called Startup Nation. Startup Nation is a book about Israel being how it started, but also that Israel right now has the second highest startup company per capita in the world, second to the US. So they are very entrepreneurial in their endeavors. Part of that is high-tech development. One of the big things is that drip irrigation. If anyone's familiar with that and have done any sort of agriculture work or even in their yard, that was invented in Israel out of a lack of water They said, we need to use this water in a very structured and intentional way. Desalinization was also something that has been a big process there. What that means is taking water that is from the sea and taking the salt out of it and making it usable. Why is that important to us? Obviously, we do not have a coast. So seems irrelevant to us. However, what we do have is a massive oil production in the southern part of New Mexico. When you pull up oil, you're also pulling up another resource, which is brackish water. Brackish water is a very, very high mineral water that's not really usable. In fracking, what they do is they drill another hole and shove it right down into the ground again. It's a little bit, from an environmental standpoint, there's some issues with that. And I'm probably downplaying that quite a bit when saying there's some issues. I'm not an expert. I just know and I'm aware that that could be very problematic down the line. This is water that you cannot store on the surface. I don't know if any of you have ever seen some of these areas where they have like big black tarps in these ponds and they put water in there. That water is not really potable, but you can still use it for other things, like irrigation or sort of purposes. They tried doing that with some of this water, learned it does not work. That the mineral content seeps down into water tables, and that's also very problematic for our water tables, being that we have a very small amount of water in the United States, or in this region. So that was my purpose, going there, and also understanding what is in twofold: water, one, but entrepreneurial issues between Palestine and Israel. What are the impediments of them trading sort of ideas and developing startups because of border issues? And that's where we get into my other interest about what are the border issues that we run into in our country with Mexico, and how do we ease those tensions for economic development? So one of the fascinating things is that Israel's become an exporter of water. They have, right now, let me get this number right, they're using roughly 40% of their drinking water is recycled water, and that's coming from different reverse osmosis or desalinization or by intentional use of drip irrigation. By 2050, that's going to be up to 70%. This is huge. This is a big indicator that if we start to use technology in our region to maximize our use of water, we may be able to, one, preserve water for future generations, which is key, but two, we may be able to actually bolster economic development here in a different way. What do I mean by that? Right now, we do flood irrigation in a lot of areas. It sounds like what it is. You open up a canal and you flood a whole acre or more or whatever of crops. And that's how we water our crops. A lot of alfalfa is watered that way, different sort of crops. And I think chili is moving away from that, but chili is sometimes watered that way. This is an issue. We are losing a lot of water to evaporation. The other thing is, anytime you're using water for a crop, then that crop gets sold, you're essentially exporting your water. That's not a very smart use of water, in my opinion, for export purposes. You're exporting a lot of water without getting a big ROI, return on your investment. I shouldn't even have to define that. I forget my audience here. Of course, you guys know that. To your end user, right? Like if I have to put X amount of gallons towards alfalfa, and then I go and sell that alfalfa, and it's not very well received, or there's not a lot of money coming back to me, I'm using a lot of water unnecessarily. Now, if I can bring that down, the use of water per dollar that I'm getting back, that's economic development to me. That's sustainable economic development. There's some discussions going on in the academic space about economic stability, sustainability versus the term economic development. I think it's an interesting concept because in a region like ours, we have to be cognizant of our resources. And so really understanding that if we can take drip irrigation and use that to increase
Chris, I
our
didn't hear that question. I think that was sent privately to you. Could you say it again?
which one?
Sustainability and development.
No, I was just making a point. There's some debate going on about economic development at whatever cost, right? That's kind of what that term has been interpreted as versus economic sustainability. How can we do things to develop economies that actually sustain rather than just go through consume and move on?
Right.
And so to me, it's an interesting concept in particular with water, because you have this idea that if we can maximize the ROI per gallon or per on water, then we can start to actually sustain these economies. So instead of this idea of let's get rid of ag in New Mexico because it's a poor use of water, scrap that. Let's use water in a different way that can sustain the agriculture development in New Mexico. This will be big in terms of commercial hemp. That is a massive use of water, and we're going to start to see that rev up. I don't have the numbers on me right now, but I know the New Mexico Department of Ag saw a major increase in the applications for commercial hemp this past year. It's a very different process than medical cannabis, which sometimes they get confused. It's easier to get licensing for hemp, and there's a lot broader use for that. So we're going to see more of this develop in New Mexico, which means that's going to have a direct impact on our water use. And so the more that we become astute with the technology available to us through other countries, in particular Israel, and start to use those resources to leverage our economic development, I really think that New Mexico has an opportunity to be a leader in the region, in an arid region, on how we use our water to sustain our economy, to sustain our families in terms of food production, because if we can produce food here at a lower cost for our communities, that means that they can allocate those dollars elsewhere that they would otherwise be spending on high cost of food.
So can I interject here and ask a question about what is diplomatic about the elements of economic growth in Israel? So Israel is using water differently from other people in the region. Am I understanding that correctly?
Absolutely.
Okay. So can you help us understand how those differences actually then need somebody to mediate them in order for trade to be facilitated? I'll give you an example. So here in New Mexico, we have an acequia system. You referred to that. And one of the challenges in New Mexico is that basically when you irrigate through an acequia system, you're designated water rights through time. In other words, you're allowed to irrigate for a day or 2 hours or whatever designation of time you're given as a member of a community that has access to that water, right? But the state engineer's office in New Mexico allocates water and deals with water disputes in terms of acre feet, which is a designation of space, right? So just for some clarification here, how does Israel treat water? Does it treat it in terms of space, or does it treat it in terms of time? Because it's my understanding that the majority of the Middle East still deals with irrigation in terms of time.
Yeah, here's a big departure from what is possible in the United States. It is all owned by the state, right? There's no private land, there's no private water ownership in Israel. All of the resource, all of it is owned by the country. I mean, that is massive departure from where our country would sit with certain things. Colorado has a similar process. It's called riparian water rights, meaning that the state determines who gets certain water. For example, in Colorado, it is illegal to collect rainwater because the state owns it, or owns the state facilitates how water is used in a much more aggressive way. Here, Bernalillo County advertises. You can get containers from the county to put at your house, and you can collect rainwater. So what I'm saying, why I make that point is in Israel, every drop of water is monitored, facilitated, and owned by the state, meaning the country. In the United States, we have private ownership of water, right? Because if you have a certain amount of acres, you are now allocated a certain amount of water to be able to farm or to produce for your livestock. So in a sense, you have a certain right to that amount of water because based on your land ownership. It's called first in time, first in right, meaning whoever owned it first, whoever was there first, has first right to use that water. In law, they call it pre-1907 water rights, and the reason for that is after 1907, water was allocated differently. Second to indigenous water rights, that is one of the most priority water rights you can have, the pre-1907. And then from there, you can start to sell water rights. You literally own it and you can sell it. For example, I just did a deal recently where we sold the land, we kept the water rights, and we kept the subsurface mineral rights, oil, whatever else may be found in those below ground. We literally just said, you own the ground and everything above it, fine. But my client's going to keep the water rights, and they're also going to keep the subsurface mineral rights, just in case there's anything there we want to find and exploit.
Can I jump in real quick? So the water stuff is so unique, and I just wanted to point out, we just had a group yesterday that we finished up with Pakistan in a conversation around water rights and all of this, and it's something we see a lot with our exchange groups. It's a common topic. But I would like to ask you, being on our board, being a participant of international exchange programs, what do you think how is your perspective as a New Mexican growing up in an area where there's a lot of scarcity, whether it be water, education? We can talk a lot about what it looks like, but you and I have had great conversations where we talked about the resiliency that the state breeds in the youth. And so I want to know what you think makes your perspective as a New Mexican internationally relevant when it comes to having these conversations and going to somewhere halfway across the world and sharing your perspective and encountering other people that are in leadership positions in their community in the same way that you're leading here in Albuquerque as a young professional. So I guess just to sum it all up, why is your perspective as a New Mexican internationally relevant?
I'm glad you asked that, because I get a lot of shit. I mean, I'm so sorry, guys. I get a lot of back flack from family or people locally. They're like, "Why are you going over there? That's all the way over. Why does that matter? Why should a little kid from New Mexico give a crap about what's going on in the Middle East and all these things?" And I always chuckle because why shouldn't we, right? I've always had that cliche mindset of, think global, act local. In other words, how can we pull from other concepts or other areas going on around the country, and then implement those here? In other words, how can I learn from someone who's been doing, particular land management or water management in a way that is more sustainable than maybe just massive commercialized agriculture, which tends to deplete soil resources? How do you learn from someone who has a more localized perspective on resource management? And so I hope that's kind of getting to your point. When you go and you start to create in-person relationships, I stay in touch with people from a lot of my friends from Palestine or from Israel on a weekly basis, and we even do Zoom calls, and we talk about what's going on in our region. What are they doing now? What developments are going on in technologically that we can then bring over to our country, or how do we start to navigate those sort of relationships? And so I guess that goes back to my original point that relationships matter. I'm a people person. I want to meet someone in person, develop that baseline understanding that we actually have some sort of mutual interest or desire to move a certain group forward, whether it's our local community in collaboration, or how can I help that person better understand what we're going through, and then we can maybe share ideas about the challenges that we face. Because we're able to compress time and space through these Zoom calls and emails and all this sort of stuff. So from my perspective, bringing localized voices to resource management, right, or economic development for that perspective is very important, because if you do not have someone at the table that is from that local area and you just have people coming in from outsourced sources saying, I think you should do it this way, without understanding the cultural significance that may be changing, right? If you tell an Acequia
Okay, I got a couple of questions on the main chat. Can you respond to Beth's question there?
Yes. Yeah. Beth, let me see. Oh, sorry, Beth. I didn't see that. In that, yes, they fund a lot of the research programs. So they will contract out with tech companies to then say, we want you to research like the desalinization plants. The largest one in the country, in the world, is in Israel. It is a state-owned company. So it's an Israeli-owned company by the government that contracted out with other tech companies for the actual technology aspect of it, but they own probably the intellectual property. They own the rights to this. The second largest one is in San Diego, desalinization plant in the world. And they are directly leasing that technology from Israel, the country. I think Brazil is going to slate it to be next. And so that is that bilateral or nation-to-nation negotiation at that point. They're entering into these trade agreements. This is exactly what's important for the United Arab Emirates, right? Because now they can start to enter into trade relations to exchange technology for tourism, for political reasons. So even though it seems like just a gesture, it actually, we see relations. The US and Israel have a very, very deep relationship. We were the first one to vote for them to be considered a nation at the UN. So the United States is considered a deep partner for Israel. Hence, we got the second largest desalinization plant in the world, right there in San Diego. I do think that those things are important because that's a relationship. When you start to make those relationships and have mutual interest, saying we want to be good partners economically, and we also want to support you geopolitically. In other words, we supply Israel with a good amount of funding for military defense. This gets a lot of flack, but there's a lot of technology that's developed out of that. The Iron Dome, which protects missiles when it comes in, we now use that at all our embassies around the world. That is a technology that was developed in Israel for the purpose of protecting missiles coming in from Gaza. But now we've taken that technology and now we can use it in our region locally. I'm pretty sure it's being used. It's implemented around our ports as well. But we also use it very actively in our embassies in other countries. So to your point, Dr. Montoya, why does it matter if we have these relationships, and how does it leverage not only for the U.S., but how does this also leverage for New Mexico, is finding that point of interest, right? If it's agriculture, great. If it's water, even better. If there's some other sort of tech development that comes along, even better. Intel is a very, very, very big presence in Tel Aviv. I think it's their second or third largest campus where they develop a lot of technology. Well, we have a big campus here for Intel. So there is importance of technological development that goes on in certain regions like Silicon Valley, but also Tel Aviv is second to Silicon Valley when it comes to tech. And if New Mexico wants to position itself as a high-tech innovator, we really need to start thinking about creating those relationships with Israel. I believe they are a sister. They have a city in Israel. It's a sister city of Albuquerque. If you're ever going through our airport, on the bottom floor towards the parking garage, look up to your left, and there's a bunch of flags. Israel's on there because I forget the city, but we have a sister city relationship with them, and it's because of the crossover with water. So, to Destiny's point is, why does it matter? Well, it takes a little bit of groundwork. It takes a little bit of, hey, I want to be interested in these sort of developments, and I want to be able to have a say in my community of what goes on. It may take some legwork to go and find out what is going on in other countries or what's going on in another region that we may be able to share ideas from. And so for me, that's where, great, thank you, Dr. Montoya. There is importance to not downplaying yourself locally, even if you cannot get out to these other places. There are organizations like Global Ties that can plug you in and bring people to you. We have so many groups that come through our state every year through Global Ties and other organizations, that you can find an area of interest and engage with these organizations and have access to individuals that go back to their community and also share leadership roles or share common interests, and you can continue to have those relationships. And you never know, in my experience, how or where that's going to benefit you down the line. Just a quick shout out to Global Ties. They brought a group about 2 years ago from the Caribbean region, and I still keep in touch with several attorneys because there was a couple attorneys on that group that are in Puerto Rico. And in Puerto Rico, there is a big pharmaceutical production economy there, and in New Mexico, we have some research labs. So there's synergy. It's unfortunate that New Mexico hasn't really owned its potential in that. And one more thing is, we are an international state, right? We have a border with Mexico. We have one of the largest borders with Mexico. Oftentimes California or Texas or Arizona, really California and Texas, get a lot of the economic development that comes out of that. New Mexico, with the development of the Santa Teresa, which I'm sure you'll hear more from Randy about, that's a key for the infrastructure part. I'm droning on about water. Why? Because that, to me, is the baseline before you can do any other building economic development wise, or roads, really truly basic infrastructure. We have one of the largest land crossings with Mexico right now. El Paso was a bridge. So there are certain pieces of equipment that cannot cross that bridge that now can cross through New Mexico. That's huge for us. That's infrastructure. We are at an opportunity here in New Mexico in our relationships in terms of international dealings that we have massive upside to developing our position in the global economy if we choose to. So I truly, truly, truly encourage every single one of you to find an area of interest, look around locally, leverage those relationships to get to the other relationships that you may use to get actively involved in whatever that is. If it's not water, if it's arts, I'm a huge advocate for the arts community. I think that we have a lot of opportunity here to be a big player in that. Santa Fe, Taos, even Albuquerque, I think
Chris,
has.
thank you. Yeah, I have a couple of concluding remarks about the Middle East that I'd like to get us to. So thank you very much. I really appreciate that. I really want to drive home this point because I think it's extremely important for us to understand that the Middle East and North Africa is going to be one of the pivotal points in the global economic environment moving forward. The reason that the Emirates and Israel having the relationship that they do right now and normalizing their trade relations is important is it's the first time in modern history where these particular disputing groups in the region are actually creating new types of trade standards that are taking place throughout the world. So for those of you that don't know, can anybody tell me where the United Arab Emirates, what their economic production was in the 1950s, 60s, or 70s? Does anybody have could anybody guess?
Oil and petroleum.
It wasn't actually. That's actually, it happens in the mid 1970s. It's pearls. Pearl farming used to be the number one export for the United Arab Emirates. Now keep in mind that this is not really a nation state as much as it is 7 cities that organize and really act like a nation. But in the 1970s, one of the things that they caught on to that other places didn't was they became the people who would translate Middle Eastern law, particularly Sharia law, into a Western banking context. And the very first people that opted out of that was Israel. They said, we will not borrow money and we will not finance anything in the same way that the Emirates or Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran will do. As oil started to become more scarce, the Emirates realized that if companies were going to survive, if you're Royal Dutch Shell or if you're Exxon or you're any of these other companies, you're going to need to finance oil rigs within these areas who have different financial systems. So for example, within the Middle East, it is actually illegal, according to the Quran and according to Sharia law, to charge interest if you're charging a loan. So as a result of that, you actually have 2 very distinct systems of running business. And in and of itself, when you need somebody to finance an oil rig and you're dealing with billions of dollars of transactions, the United Arab Emirates was the very first to come forth and say, we're going to actually relax some of our standards and we're going to translate between Western finance systems and systems that have Sharia law. And as a result of that, by the time the 1970s rolled out, they were the ones that were actually collecting the money for providing that service between the West and those oil-rich countries that had an entirely different financial and legal system. And as a result of that, that is the secret of the Emirates becoming a very wealthy per capita place. What happens now with Israel and the Emirates is that you see for the first time, Israel walked away very quickly from that because there was a military dimension to that. So this kind of financial, this diplomacy that's taking place right now is relatively unprecedented in the Middle East. It's actually a huge deal to think about how people are actually willing to deal with that. And very less likely that this is going to move forward on ideological grounds. It is going to be on economic development grounds. And people are now translating a lot of those issues into economic development angles. The last thing I want to say about this is Saudi Arabia becomes a very interesting part of this, Morocco and Saudi Arabia, because Morocco and Saudi Arabia represent 2 different angles of the relationship of Islam to the rest of the world. Morocco was seen, especially in World War II, as being relatively lax in terms of its interest in Sharia law and its exposition of that in the world. But Saudi Arabia only 3 years ago allowed women to drive. And one of the things that's very interesting about that is for the first time ever, that rule was changed, not because it was a social justice issue, but because people were able to convince the Saudi Arabian government and the Crown Prince that it was an economic inhibition. And so you're going to see a lot of that going on throughout the Middle East, that social issues and cultural divides, while massively important, they're also now being translated into economic issues. It's like, instead of saying it's the right thing to do to allow women to drive, people are now making the argument saying it's actually economic nonsense for you to not allow people to drive of any gender. So in and of itself, that's going to be the frontier of what's going on within the Middle East. And you're going to start seeing that as those social issues translate into economic issues, you're going to see a lot of people paying attention and adapting that. And I think what Chris has done in his career you spent the majority of your life actually paying attention to the nuances of how those legal disputes and those legal dissimilarities actually then have to be translated into those kinds of economic drivers. So in and of itself, I really think that if you guys want to have a conversation with Chris, you guys should reach out. If it's okay, Chris, I'm going to actually put some of your details and make them available. But I do think that those conversations should be happening, because that's actually the frontier of what economic diplomacy has become. Global Ties has actually done that into great effect. Is that most of, how many Global Ties, let me ask you guys, how many of your visitors come under social and cultural understanding auspices, but then are really kind of primarily focused on economic development or economic metrics, and how they can learn more about developing economic metrics?
Yeah, so that's hard for us, because every year we get, because of the programs that we facilitate being under the auspices of the U.S. Department of State, we see different priorities every year. And I will say, in the last couple of years under the current administration, we have seen a lot less economic development, entrepreneurship focused programs than what we did in, say, 2017, when the standards were still set by the Obama administration. So these shift, right, with every administration, but we do see this. And particularly right now, which I think is interesting that you brought up women driving in Saudi Arabia, is we see more than anything, if we're talking anything economic development, it is focused with women and economic development and prioritizing how women incorporate into these systems. So we receive about 400 plus visitors every year. Of the projects we've seen over the past couple of years, we've seen a lot less, but it's still instrumental to every single group we bring in, whether it be a public health group or art or whatever. Economic development plays into this, infrastructure plays into any topic we bring in. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, it does. It does. Because the interaction I've had with you guys and conversations with Chris is that the majority of that almost immediately moves into how is this going to shape our economic destiny. So there's that urgency is now, I mean, it used to be that everybody could have a conversation about human rights and leave it within the domain of human rights. That's no longer the logic of economic diplomacy. It moves very quick, well, of any form of diplomacy, it moves very quickly from social justice and human rights issues into how that's a conversation, shared conversation with the standards or conventions of how we develop an economy. And it's one of the reasons I think the MENA region is such a fascinating place right now. Yeah. So it's 1:58. Thank you very much, Chris, for your time. I know that you have an actual, you have trial actually, right? Later on within the hour.
Yeah, we have a 3 o'clock. It's very strange now. It's all Zoom stuff, so I get to do it from here. But yeah, I do have something at 3. But I appreciate you guys having me on. I probably droned on and bored some of you, but my contact information, happy to give it out. Happy to grab, coffee, lunch, a drink, whatever it is, and talk more about whatever it is that may have come up of interest. It's such a dense area that it's hard to compress into an hour. All I want to say and really emphasize is relationships. These things really, truly matter in diplomatic conversations, cultural understanding and sensitivity, and developing those relationships through that lens will then lead you into whatever X you're interested in, and you pick that and fill it. And I really, truly, in my personal experience, that has been the biggest determinant of any sort of successful relationship or negotiation.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Chris. Please give Chris our warm regards. Thank you. The reaction buttons are much appreciated. And as we move forward and invite Juan, actually Global Ties is right there in the brewery where Juan is going to present. Let's take a 5-minute break, bathroom break, yes. Take some water, and then we'll reconvene and we'll begin with Juan's journey from Colombia to being an entrepreneur here in Albuquerque. So thank you guys, 5 minutes. So that's 1:04, we'll begin. Thank you.
And he has the best coffee in town.
Yes. Thank you very much, Chris. Take care.
All right. Take care, guys.